Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest Work Foundation event, which today is focused on the future of remote and hybrid work in the UK. My name is Ben Harrison, and I'm director here at the Work Foundation. We're a research and policy think tank based at Lancaster University. We're committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment, and our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage in the labour market, as well as the interrelationship between health and work and the challenges facing young people in the UK labour market at the moment. An important note at the top of the event for those dialed in, if you'd like to access subtitles for the session this morning, live captioning has been enabled, so please do click on the CC button on the black bar at the bottom of the screen and you should be able to access them there. Now, to help frame the conversation today, I want to begin by taking you through some slides which illustrate the nature of the rise and the potential reverse of remote and hybrid working in the UK. So if we can pop the slides up now, please, that would be great. I'm sure everyone on the call today understands that the increase that we've seen in the incidence of hybrid and remote working has been one of the biggest shifts in the world of work over the last 6 years, and no doubt impacted by the sudden and swift changes employers faced during the lockdowns of the pandemic. What we saw was many of the technical and cultural barriers that had perhaps previously resisted many of those requests to work in a more hybrid fashion had to be overcome in order to keep businesses going during what was an unprecedented period of time. And that, of course, has then represented a significant shift in the lives of millions of UK workers, with 1 in 5 workers now working mainly from home, compared to just 1 in 20 in 2019. Next slide, please. And the data suggests that the UK has one of the highest rates of home working internationally, and there's lots of evidence emerged over the course of recent years that it's delivered many benefits for workers, including disabled people, those with caring responsibilities, and parents in particular. Next slide, please. But this shift, of course, has had other impacts too, particularly for employers when thinking about introducing policies in the workplace. And that's including on how teams are organised, how managers can best balance the competing needs within and between teams, and of course, take up of remote and hybrid options and the introduction of policies to support it has not been even or uniform across sectors or regions. Next slide, please. And it appears in recent months, in particular, an increasing number of employers are actively exploring ways to potentially reverse some of the shift to more hybrid and remote working. We've seen a number of high-profile stories in the media from organisations issuing so-called back to the office mandates for their employees. And I think the debate that has ensued as a result has sort of illustrated a number of really important points. It's both demanded, I guess, evidence around the important role that increased instances of remote and hybrid work has brought to different parts of the labour market. But equally, it's highlighted concerns regarding the inequalities that can arise between those who are able to work from home and those who can't. And of course, we have these persistent assumptions, but ultimately limited data regarding how productive or unproductive increased working from home ultimately is. And this debate is happening at a time when the government remains focused on delivering new rights to access flexible working and on addressing the challenge of health-related economic inactivity, which has also been such a big feature of labour market debates in the UK following the pandemic. So this is the discussion that we're going to be exploring today. We can close the slides now. Thank you. And to help us to do that, I'm delighted that we're going to be hearing from an expert panel, including Baroness Scott, Chair of the House of Lords Home Working Committee, Dr. Paula Holland, a Senior Lecturer in Public Health at Lancaster University, Louise Brown, Vice Principal for Corporate Services at Wigan and Leigh College, and Vicki Davenport, Head of Organisation Effectiveness at NHS Supply Chain. And to begin with, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide a short reflection before opening up the conversation more broadly. And throughout the event this morning, I'm going to be looking to bring in questions from those of you on the call. So if you would like to ask a question or put forward a point of view, please do use the Q&A tab, and I'll do my best to bring in as many as I can. But to begin with, let's hear from our panelists. So Louise, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, thanks, Ben, and it's a real privilege for me to be part of this conversation. As we rewind 6 years ago, remote working really wasn't a strategy. Certainly for us, it was a survival response, as it was for many. It was reactive, it was imperfect. I still have ingrained on my brain the day that staff were running down the car park with PCs and chairs and all sorts of things, heading home to try and keep business continuity going for our students and our staff. But for me, it was very uncomfortable then, but it forced something that I think was we were heading towards anyhow. That was about leadership and trust at scale, which had been perhaps resisted for quite a long time. And I think that's what changed everything. Because we've seen since it's not just a shift in where we work, but a shift in what work actually means. And for many people, particularly carers, parents, and those managing long-term health conditions, remote and hybrid working hasn't just offered flexibility, it's offered access. It's opened up such opportunities for them, for their progression and their dignity, if we really want to say it as it is, and I believe. But I think this is where an honest conversation needs to start, because it's not been linear since that point. And what I kind of see is a quiet recalibration is happening across workforces, often framed around culture and collaboration and productivity. But underneath all that, I think it's deeper, and the tensions are around control and trust, and the difference between visibility and value. I think probably the real conversation that we need to have is around that, because hybrid, I don't think was ever meant to be sort of a halfway house. It was and still is an opportunity, I think, to redesign, work more intelligently, and also open up those pools of talent and skills that we're all desperately clambering for there, because there's a whole host of skills and people with great value that are out there that hybrid working can enable us to sort of tap into. The risk now is that it just becomes perhaps a policy debate, and how many days in, 2 days in, 3 days out, or in such a restrictive way, and not really recognising that it's a leadership capability. I don't think the future is fully remote, fully hybrid. I think it has to be the blend of what meets particular business need, but also recognising that it is about where should people work, and what does work really look like, and what do our people need to do that really well. It needs maturity, probably, beyond looking at work as a line of sight. It's about culture and performance and contribution, and not necessarily proximity. So they're sort of my views around that. It will require courage and ongoing courage, because inclusivity and flexibility is more complex than blanket rules, but it's also more human and ultimately more effective, I believe, in my view. So for me, the future of remote and hybrid isn't under threat. I think it's a crossroads that needs to capture some of that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise. Really helpful. And I think a sort of really good challenge to not see this as a kind of means to an end, or in a reductive way, but actually something of real strategic importance. Paula, I'll come to you now first for some initial reflections, please. And obviously you've been leading a very large and impactful study over recent years on the impacts of this agenda for disabled workers in particular. So great to get your reflections.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, good provocative question. So definitely think remote and hybrid working is here to stay. You know, it's not without its challenges, but the benefits for workers, their families, employers, and society in general have been well documented in mine and other studies. You know, the pandemic forced us into widespread remote working if you were a desk-based worker rather than a perk for a lucky few. And in the studies I've seen, most people now want to work at home for at least part of the week if they're in a desk-based role, because they've reported benefits for their work, their health, and their well-being. So it's impossible to turn the clock back and retain a happy and productive workforce. And many organisations are also recognising that offering staff remote and hybrid working and other types of flexibility, which is equally important, is key to attracting and retaining staff. So, but not only is there demand for remote working, we actually need it. So my research, as you just said, it focused on the experience of disabled remote and hybrid workers. The UK has got a large disability employment gap of 29 percentage points, and we've got 2.8 million people out of work due to illness. So in the Inclusive Remote and Hybrid Working Study, which we've been running, funded by the Nuffield Foundation, in our survey of over 1,200 disabled remote and hybrid workers, most found remote and hybrid positive for their health, well-being and work. And in addition, a DWP survey found a quarter of people not working because of health reasons said they would be able to work if they could work from home. So remote and hybrid must be here to stay if we want to meet the needs of workers and job seekers, and I'd say employers too. But we need to be mindful. Firstly, the proportion of jobs, as you've said, advertised as remote since the pandemic has declined. LinkedIn have done analysis and they say that demand for remote and hybrid jobs outstrips supply. And this is concerning given the benefits that we've seen for workers and job seekers, particularly disabled people, parents and carers. So we need to see an expansion of remote and hybrid job opportunities. Secondly, we need to be mindful, as has already been said, about the benefits of remote and hybrid aren't equally shared. You know, we found that disabled people from ethnic minority backgrounds and low-income households were less likely to report benefits of remote and hybrid. And that means that just allowing staff to work from home isn't enough. We do need to improve working conditions more widely. And lastly, of course, we know that not all jobs can be done from home. And so we need to see provision of other forms of flexibility, unless we want to see a gulf developing between the health and well-being of remote and on-site workers. So they're my thoughts for now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula. Really helpful. Baroness Scott, I'll come to you next. And obviously, you've chaired the House of Lords committee on lots of these issues. So it would be great to get your reflections on it, but also perhaps some of the things that you heard through that evidence gathering process.
That's great. Well, look, first of all, thank you so much for asking me to come today, Ben. Really appreciate the invitation. So my name's Ros Scott, Baroness Scott, and I chaired a committee of inquiry in the House of Lords on the question of working from home. And it was really prompted by the fact that, you know, stories are appearing and have been for about 18 months or so, pretty much on a daily basis about one aspect or another of home working, and we thought we'd see if we could shed a bit of light. So just worth saying that these are sort of one-off committees. So we did our work between February and November. We took evidence between March and July, and then produced this wonderful report. I can't see my own screen, so myself on the screen, so I'm sort of hoping you saw that. Our report, which sort of brings together, I think, for the first time, quite a large body of evidence, and we were looking at the subject through 3 different lenses, although of course they're linked. So we were looking at impacts on the individual, we were looking at impacts on organizations, and we were looking at what we called for shorthand externalities, and that was things like the impact on transport, on leisure and retail, and questions about broadband, cybersecurity, and so on. And I mean, I think one of the things that really struck us right across the piece was how little hard data there was. And that's quite tricky for a House of Lords Select Committee, because we're not just there to sort of give our opinions, we're there to look at the evidence and come up with evidence-based conclusions and recommendations. And it's quite hard when you don't have the hard data. So all the way through the report, there are references to the need to understand certain things better and start collecting data. I think the other thing that really struck us was how many contradictions we found. So, for example, without fail, employers told us that having a hybrid option for their workforce improved the retention of staff and gave them much better recruitment outcomes. And yet, at that time, only about 12% of jobs were being advertised. I think your figure's about 13.5, but you know, they're not a million miles apart. So we couldn't really get to, well, if it's so good for recruitment and retention, why aren't you advertising? And nobody seemed to be able to answer that. It was evident to us, and continues to be evident, that back to office mandates are increasing, people going from, or organisations going from 2 to 3 days and so on. But this isn't entirely borne out by the data that we heard from, for example, transport companies or from office accommodation companies. And I noticed last week when NCP went into administration, they talked about one of the contributors being people not commuting. So we're not clear to what extent these back to office mandates are actually being enforced. I think the third contradiction we really picked up was, you know, government have a clear ambition to get more long-term sick and disabled people back into the workforce. And yet, you know, as a major employer itself, it's enforcing a 3-day week back in the office. So, you know, these are the sort of contradictions that we found all through. And I think by the time we got to the end of it, it seemed pretty clear to us that this really is the sort of new frontier of industrial relations. On the whole, individuals like having this sort of autonomy for all sorts of good reasons. And organisations are less keen, although when challenged, no one was really able to give us any evidence about the impact on productivity. It was about, and I'm not saying these are unimportant, but it was about things like collaboration, mentoring, organisational culture, and so on, as a need to get people back into the office. But this clearly is going to go on being quite a source of friction. And we spent quite a lot of time trying to get our heads around the impact of the new employment rights legislation, because if organisations are going to have to give good reasons why they're turning down flexible working requests, you know, it remains to be seen how they're going to prove some of these sort of less tangible things. So I do think the benefits to individuals are now so great, and the benefits to organisations can be if it's done properly. So I think this is here to stay, but we are really, I think, very much only in the foothills of this significant change in the working lives of many people. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ros. And really clear illustration there of some of the kind of messiness and contradictions involved in both the kind of policies and implementation themselves, but also the wider debate. Vicki, I'll come to you now, and you've obviously experienced this shift in a couple of different employer settings, and so it would be great to get your reflections, and then we'll open it out into a wider conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I'm probably going to build on a lot of the points everyone else said, but I guess laying that lens in terms of actually living and breathing it in an organisation, kind of on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and certainly over the last 6 years. So I think for me, look, if we start to take a step back, there is a significant change happening in terms of like whether organisations are really willing to embrace doing things differently and really redesigning like how work is working and being done as part of it. So it shifts that question from where, but more into that space of how, which I know a few others have really talked about. I think, you know, for me, when I look at it over the last 6 years, we've seen actually what is possible. And I am very much a, well, what's the art of the possible? What's not impossible to achieve as part of it? So, you know, we've seen that access has widened. We've had better access to talent pools and they've been expanded. And really for many, work has become much more attainable, which it may not have been before, certainly in some of the examples that have been shared there through, you know, the studies that have happened. But I guess for me, we're just seeing attention. And and it's how we want to navigate and deal with that tension. And I don't think there's a one size fits all in that. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges organisations are facing, of moving from what has almost been a standard approach to a little bit more of a segmented approach to how we go about these things. So, you know, for me, there are what I call kind of different stages within people's careers. So whether that's someone stepping in from an early careers point of view and what they need from the workplace and how they might need to work, to someone who might be in a senior role, as an example, and how they might need to work. So for me, there's this big shift from standardization to actually really starting to look at those different career moments for our colleagues, and therefore how do we need to kind of change. I think for me, the biggest shift I'm expecting us to see really is the language. I think we'll stop with the hybrid remote language and actually just talk much more around flexibility. So, and I think that language shift is quite significant for me, because, you know, flexibility has almost always been associated with a policy. And I think that's the biggest bit I'm pushing, certainly in the HR field at the moment, and certainly in organisations that I work in terms of actually how do we shift from it being about a policy, but how do we really create meaningful workplaces that people want to connect with, whether that's coming in and being present, versus how they then contribute and deliver what's needed as part of it. So for me, I think the one size fits all is out the window. It's really about kind of what are the different moments that we need, really understanding at an individual level, like what does flexibility mean? And certainly when we're having people join us through our recruitment activities and accessing talent pools, it is the biggest question that is asked, like, what does flexibility look like here? And I think for me, it's the question back is, well, what does flexibility look like to you? Like, where are you at? And what does that mean you're going to need from us as part of it as well? So I think those, for me, three big shifts we'll start to see, you know, moving from that being presence to performance. So like, what is it we need our people to deliver, not necessarily where they sit to deliver it. That shift around one size fits all. Not every role needs to be designed in the same way. And I have lots of conversations around, well, you know, what is it you need the role to do? How does that work need to be designed? And therefore, how does that work need to be delivered? But a big piece for me is really around that leadership capability and that manager capability. I think when we stepped into the pandemic, a lot of people were thrown into that space. For me, there's now a point where we need to take a step back that says, how do we set leaders, managers and people up for success, to a meaning that the business performs, but people can perform as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vicki. And if I can invite all of our panelists now to turn their cameras back on, we'll perhaps delve a little bit deeper into some of those points that have been raised. And in particular, I suppose I wanted to begin drawing on some of the things that each of you have reflected on, really, but to begin the conversation around what does it look like for remote and hybrid working policies to be introduced well into the workplace? Because I think, Ros, in particular, as you were sort of offering your reflections from what you heard as the committee, clearly there was a kind of range of views and some contradictions bound up in that. But presumably what you also heard was, when done well, it can yield benefits X and Y. If it's not done well, then there are various challenges. So it would be great maybe to start with you, Ros, just get some sort of a bit of a drill down from what you heard as part of the committee.
Yeah, I mean, it was clear from what we heard that there's a huge variety in the extent to which both organisations and the managers within them are really thoughtful about this. And, you know, we heard some utterly ridiculous things, like, you know, getting people back in the office because of collaboration, and then people go in and they spend the whole day talking to other folk on Zoom, you know, or there isn't a desk for them because the organisation has downsized their office accommodation, and you come in and you're not sitting next to anybody. So, you know, for heaven's sake, that we've got to do better than that. But we also heard from organisations where they've really thought about it, and so, you know, you have kind of anchor days. You get people coming, teams coming in on particular days, so you do get the collaboration and so on. And it's not, you know, this ought not to be rocket science, but it was surprising how often it was lacking. And I think, you know, what we heard a lot of was actually how poor management can be in the United Kingdom, and I'll maybe come back to this at the end, but that we don't invest in it in the same way, and that applies regardless of whether people are working remotely, hybrid, or completely in person. But it's particularly important when people are working hybrid or remote, because if you like, the shortcomings are amplified by not having that visibility, and also amplified by the fact that some of the data we saw shows that it's managers the most likely people to want to work from home. So if they're working from home and they're not very good at managing, I mean, that's not a great recipe, is it?
Yeah. And I suppose, I mean, what we've heard as well through the work we've been doing when it comes to managers is, very often they feel like they're the ones who are on the front line having to deal with a kind of wide variety of requests, and against the backdrop potentially of imperfect policies as well. So alongside that underinvestment in management, they're also the ones who are sort of at that apex. But I'm going to come both to you, Louise, and Vicki, around some of this. But Paula, in this question of designing these policies well, are there particular considerations when we're thinking about disabled workers and sort of ensuring that they can access and yield the benefits of some of these policies?
Absolutely. So as well as the 1,200 disabled remote and hybrid workers, we also interviewed 45 employers, directors and so on. And I think the employers in the sample, they had a varied in practice. They'd gone fully remote, some had flexible hybrid where we don't care where you work, just get the work done, and at the other extreme were people with mandated fixed days. And I think in terms of supporting disabled people with long-term health conditions, allowing flexibility is absolutely critical. So there's decades and decades of research around autonomy and flexibility and its importance for health and well-being. And so if you start mandating people to work on particular days or a particular number of days, and it doesn't fit with their needs and preferences, particularly if they're disabled or got a long-term health condition, you're going to undermine their health and well-being and ability to stay in employment. So in our survey of 1,200 disabled people, the majority said that remote and hybrid have been positive for their health, their well-being, their ability to care, ability to parent, ability to manage their health condition, productivity, and so on. And we found that these benefits they're more likely to report positive benefits the more they work from home. So if you've got employers mandating people to come into the office on certain days, then you're going to undermine that. We also found disabled people being subjected to hot desking, particularly because organisations are downsized, and that is just not compatible. If you've got reasonable adjustments, you need a sit-stand desk or particular ergonomic chairs or keyboards and stuff. Or if you've got social anxiety, neurodivergence, and you need certainty about where you are working, then hot desking just doesn't work. So employers need to opt disabled people out of hot desking, opt them out of mandated work days. We know that people know where they best work. In terms of productivity, most of the sample again said that they were more productive at home. I think I've not got the right. 69% were most productive at home. Only 5% were more productive in the office. And I think sometimes people dispute the power of self-reported data, but we're sensible, aren't we? We know where we work better, and there was lots of evidence to suggest that that was entirely the case.
Really interesting. Thanks for that, Paula. Really important reflections, I think, on how the wider shifts and implications of moving to a more flexible model, such as the example you gave around hot desking, then in itself can have unintended consequences for some of those workers that we're trying to support in particular. Louise, I was going to come to you next because I think you raised some important challenges in your sort of opening reflections around, this sort of shift from initially being flexible, responsive, trying to keep the lights on as an employer during this kind of unprecedented period, to now trying to shift to a place where we're more intentional and purposeful in how we introduce some of these policies. Can you maybe just talk about where you think some of the really important factors in that shift are going to be, and I guess building on some of the points that you've heard from Ros and Paula, that actually this can be inherently challenging and messy within organisations to get the right mix and balance right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I come back to the point where I believe that this all stands or falls on that leadership and management capability, and that things aren't insurmountable there. We were all flung into this position, whether we liked it or not, weren't we, 6 years ago? But what that's presented itself is some fantastic opportunities, really, for business, for individuals, and for the health and well-being as us all, or for us all as a nation, really. There's so many benefits there, and for us as a further education college, where as soon as that shift came back post-pandemic, the amount of education establishments such as us that went, right, everybody back in, and there was very quickly a two-tier approach developed because individuals were looking to those organisations that hadn't taken the learning, because there was a lot of learning from that recognition that there was a reset and that people had rebalanced their work-life balance, their needs, their well-being, and they weren't afraid to sort of talk out loud about these long-term health conditions, where I think before the pandemic, a lot of people kept that to themselves, thought it'll be treated as a negative, or things like that, and people became far more open and transparent about that. We embraced hybrid working. We looked at that and thought, what is the art of the possible? How can this help our workforce, but also help us massively as a business, impacting on our bottom line of increased retention and engagement rates for staff, increase those talent pools far and wide, save us money, energy. You know, in the holidays, for example, we used to have people coming in, because we're not like a school academic contract. We used to have people coming in and rattling around empty buildings, sitting there from 8:30 in the morning till 5 o'clock in a quite a lonely environment, where we were heating, receptions, site staff, everything else. It's provided us with some real efficiencies there, but also those opportunities that in the holidays, this is about outputs. It goes back to the trust element of it. I'm not bothered if, as long as the planning is done, they can go and take their kids to the park and whatnot and work into the evening, as long as those, you know, the outputs are there. But one of the shocking things that really struck me early on, when I was talking to one of our managers around this, was that it was all about, well, how do I know that they're going to be doing the work? And we're a multi-site. We've got 8 sites now. So I very quickly just said, well, if one of your team works over at one of our other sites, it doesn't matter whether sat there or sat somewhere, you know, in Lancashire, Lancaster, wherever it might be. It's how you measure, how you're setting those targets, how you're leading and managing, you know, and the value of what that gets back. So I think for this to work, and I absolutely believe in the right context and right environment, and not one shape will fit all. And that's where you get inexperienced or unconfident managers that want a black and white. They come to me and say, what do I do? Do I do this? Well, how many days? What? And it, for me, it will never work to its best value if we're trying to approach it in such a constrained way. It is about trust. It is absolutely around that, and leaders and managing well and trusting their teams. And if you get that right, the benefits of this can actually be phenomenal, opening up such a wide pool of talent and skill that we so desperately need.
Thanks, Louise. That's really helpful. And Vicki, maybe just coming on to that, because we've had a question from Claire McCartney in the Q&A around, you know, I guess acknowledging these challenges for managers, and you've just been touching on some there as well, Louise, but asking, you know, what can be done to support more leaders and managers in this endeavour. And I suppose it would be also just good to get your reflections, because I don't want to dismiss them through the course of this conversation, around where there really are challenges around workplace culture. If we do have very fragmented patterns of working in an organisation, and where that might undermine opportunities to collaborate, as perhaps Ros was saying they heard at the committee. Any reflections around that and what can be done to mitigate that risk would be really helpful too.
Yeah, look, for me, I think there's, leaning into Louise's point, there's a big bit around trust. I think the other bit is around clarity. And I think that's probably one of the biggest bits I see missing in organizations when we're having these conversations is around the clarity. So, there's some key questions I think when you're working as a manager you can ask. So certainly for me, there's that, how do you perform at your best? Because that will look and feel different for everybody. And I think opening that door to treat people in the workplace as adults and knowing that they understand themselves best is quite key in that space. I think the other piece for me then is around the expectations that we set. So being really clear on what is the expected outcome to be delivered, whether that's in terms of the work to be delivered, the behaviours we expect, that how we collaborate and work together is quite key as well. And I think if those things aren't all at play, that's then where you end up with this space of ambiguity, which I think is what a lot of managers and leaders struggle to navigate. And, we've done a number of things quite recently. So for me, it's really important we involve our network groups because, I am not huge on policy because I think often policy can become too rigid and doesn't allow the flexibility that's needed, but appreciate there is value in the policy in the right spaces. So I often call it freedom in a framework. And I often think managers are used to some of that autonomy. And I think as HR, we've probably played a critical role in that of having policies for the right reasons. But often those policies can feel quite restrictive in terms of doing the right thing, both by the individual and the organisation. So certainly things I'm pushing kind of with my field at the moment around how do we shift from everything being about a policy, but to create much more trust in terms of it. So involving our network groups for me is really critical in that because they've got the lived experiences that can help us as an organisation shape what that needs to look and feel like. And our networks have played a huge role in terms of some of the recent initiatives we've done. So, we've opened up kind of following some operating model changes 2-3 years ago. We've just opened up some new offices, but our network groups have been involved in helping us shape how those offices look and feel on a day-to-day. So some of them, there are fixed desks for people who prefer that. We've got collaborative spaces. We've got much more casual breakout spaces. We've got meeting rooms if you need a meeting room. We've got a wellbeing room as part of that. We've got pods if you just need to be in a confidential conversation. So our colleagues have been involved in helping us shape what the workplace of the future needs to look and feel like for them to deliver their best work. The other piece we've done is in terms of our recruitment, we're really transparent that we offer hybrid working. So it's not and we're then really clear on in what roles is that. And therefore, when you're having a conversation about the role, being really clear on what the expectation is. So hybrid may look like this in this particular role, but it looks like this in this role. But we advertise that as part of it because I think that really does attract that diverse talent pool that you need and absolutely breaks down some of those barriers as part of it. And then for me, the other piece then is that we call it our modes of working. So rather than almost saying it's 2 days, it's 1 day, it's 3 days on these days, there's autonomy for teams to design that around what they need. So, and it is about managers and leaders stepping into those confident conversations, not restricted by a policy or this is how we do it here. So we call it our modes of working. So we've got really clear on when is work better done together. So that's through collaboration, that alignment, the conversation. So that could be, we have graduates who join us every year. We know that in that earlier part of their career, that connection, collaboration is so important. But we equally appreciate there is just times when work is better done individually. And often that's when it's kind of much deeper work, that delivery, just focus time. Because, I find it difficult sometimes if the office is really full to do that focus stuff, but I build my diary around what that looks and feels like. And then the other piece we then talk about is like when it's about external impact. So how we need to show up for partners, customers, stakeholders. So we really talk about in terms of that modes of working rather than it's these fixed days, but with that autonomy of you understand your team, you understand the work that your team needs to deliver, and therefore you should understand how that work needs to be set well. And that really leans into that kind of clarity, expectation and trust piece then.
Brilliant, really helpful, Vicki. Actually, you raised there one particular worker group that I did want to sort of just focus on next, actually, around young people kind of coming into the workplace. And Ros, I know you sort of heard evidence around some of this and potential concerns, I suppose, that a young person coming into a very flexible working environment that has lots of remote and hybrid work may, in a sense, risk missing out on some of that learning by osmosis almost, or sort of mentorship that can happen within the early part of someone's career. It would be great to maybe just hear a little bit about that and whether there were any sort of any evidence given as to how it might mitigate that risk.
Well, I mean, you're right. We did hear quite a bit about that, and the interesting the groups who, in terms of age cohorts, the groups who report, the working in the office most favourably are younger people and older people, and it's kind of common sense, isn't it? Because if you're, the 30 to 50 are the people who usually have childcaring responsibilities, and it sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that the autonomy that comes with flexible working to manage that. So we did hear concern actually from young people themselves about that getting into the office thing. And of course, we're talking about a cohort, many of whom did a big chunk of their schooling and education during lockdown. So it's a sort of, at one level they're used to it. For most of us, it was a bit of a thing, wasn't it, when we first started talking to each other on screens for work purposes? But they're sort of used to that. On the other hand, there's just a lot about almost about the social aspect of working that they felt they were missing out on. And I think this really just brings us back to the point that other speakers have made so well about having the policies, but more importantly, the sort of management imagination and confidence to think about how you can how you can organize things better, so you do get some of those benefits. And then we've also heard a bit, I mean, it's an important sort of side thing, but that younger people are also less likely to have good home working conditions. If they're still living at home or if they're sharing flats and that sort of thing, that there are still some issues about that. Now, that's not a game changer, but it is again where, employers have to, if they're serious about doing this, need to have a kind of mature dialogue, don't they, with their employees about how you can get around some of these things. Because we also heard great stuff. You can get around almost anything, but you have to want to do it.
And actually, I was just going to ask a follow-up on that, was for you as well, because we had a great question from Astrid Allen, who sort of references some evidence that you received from Nick Bloom, obviously an expert in this space, almost sort of casting a little bit of doubt as to how significant that pushback against hybrid and remote working has been. That obviously there's these high-profile instances of it, but actually the data maybe suggests we're still seeing it sort of as a sort of important part of the mix. So did you hear from a lot of employers who were in favour as well as those who were perhaps raising concerns?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we talked to some, at kind of one extreme end, we talked to employers who have no physical premises at all. And they've made it work really well for them. And in fact, have argued that they wouldn't have been able to grow and develop as a business in the way they did had they been sort of saddled with the costs of accommodation. And also because they were able to bring together the people who absolutely were the best for them, regardless of their geographic location. So, you certainly can do that. I mean, what we just didn't really get was from employers who are bringing people back to the office was a sense of exactly why. We had the stuff about collaboration and creativity. And of course, in some roles, that is really important. I absolutely get that. But I don't think we spoke to a single organisation in the public or private sector who was able to point to anything hard around productivity. And that's why I'm so interested in how it's going to play out when people start having their flexible working requests turned down, and employers, are they going to, is that going to be enough, or are they going to have to put a bit more focus into demonstrating why it matters? Are they going to have to think about it a bit more?
Yes. Well, actually, that does very neatly lead us into a sort of question that we've had through the Q&A around the challenges when we do equip managers and their teams to be sort of defining what flexibility might look like, if that then comes into conflict perhaps with other teams in the organisation or other bits of the organisation. I did just want to ask both Louise and Vicki to maybe reflect a little bit on that, because again, I absolutely take the point was that nothing is insurmountable on one level, but obviously it can be challenging and difficult to balance the needs or the kind of requests of different teams within an organization. So Louise, is that a kind of a genuine sort of factor and dynamic in here? And what are some of the mechanisms, I suppose, that might help colleagues ultimately overcome them?
Yeah. I think in the earlier days, it was a definite, what I heard an awful lot said to me was, but it's not fair because a receptionist can't work from home or a teacher can't work from home, but others can, and they'll see it as unfair. So I sort of peeled back the layers a bit on that, because there's lots of differences between numerous roles in an organisation, that from standard terms and conditions to pension schemes to all sorts of things that are out there. And we shouldn't be afraid of that, because a different role has a different requirement. But in line with that, we didn't say, oh, well, teachers can't possibly work from home. We looked at that with a set of creative eyes to say, what is the art of the possible? And then we introduced the opportunities that in the holidays, where because teachers used to come in, they'd have their set standard leave, so they all were able to work and do their roles. They can come in if they want. There's still access to the buildings, but we did it that way. But we also did things like when they're doing their marking. So they would have finished maybe teaching in class at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and sit there for 2 hours in a staff room doing their marking. Now, as long as there's enough that it's being led and managed, that department, appropriately. So if students do need access, there are staff there. But they can go home and do that marking, and they can do that at 7 o'clock in the evening. They can go at 3 o'clock and pick their kids up from school, or they can have that doctor's appointment, or they can do their physical exercise that is so important for their mental and physical well-being, and they can plan their weeks around that. So I believe that there are opportunities. There will always be differences. They're different jobs. There's different needs. There's different business needs, and you need that maturity of as an organisation, and that maturity in the leadership and management there, not to be afraid to say, well, roles are different.
Yes,
That's why
yeah,
people get paid differently. It's like saying everybody has to be paid the same, isn't it? It's no different than that. And if you change the narrative and you shift that thinking, then the art of the possible does start to open up, and the
yeah.
value that brings both for the business and the individuals, it's massive.
Fantastic. That's really helpful, Louise. Vicky, come to you for reflections on that as well. And just briefly, if you have concerns around, I think Ros has raised the challenge a couple of times around the kind of new Employment Rights Act measures that are due to come in next year and some of the new precedents that might get set as part of that, and how you're maybe trying to get ahead of them as an employer, that would be really fascinating as well.
Yeah, so I think for us, we've really tried to take a proactive rather than a reactive approach to it. So questions like, what does flexibility mean to you, gets ahead of any kind of bills that are coming in and kind of changes within that. So for us, it's about being intentional around kind of what sort of organisation do we want to be, and what is the workplace and environment we want to create, and understanding where can we already create some of that flexibility without waiting for it to be something through the employment rights and things like that. So for me, I think there is a big bit around mindset here. Like, you don't have to wait for a policy to come in before you can take a proactive step forward to go, what does this need to look like? We're currently going through a transformation program, and the key questions I'm asking is, from our colleagues' point of view, what do they want work to feel like over the next 5 years? And equally, how is work going to be designed for us over the next 5 years as we start to kind of deliver the next phase of transformation? I work in a lot of spaces which is around kind of this intersection of the transformation plans, the people strategy, the how do we work today versus how do we need to work tomorrow. And for me, it opens up a space of question and curiosity. And I think for me, where I see organisations do it well is they step into that space of, what is the art of the possible, being curious as part of it. And look, there's always going to be some form of tension. I think where you can shift some of that tension is by really putting it back on, you know, colleagues or managers going, well, why wouldn't it work as part of it? And equally asking that question around just what does it mean to you? Because I think when you individualize it, make it more individual and do that individualization, it's more meaningful because you're taking into account everyone's individual circumstances. And that's the shift that will be the bit that gets it right. And that's why, for me, it's not a one size fits all. And I don't think that's even a one size fits all at an organizational level. It's at a team level and all the way down to an individual level. For me, is how you step into that. But I think it's just be proactive, not reactive. And I think there's a real great space. You know, I'm currently talking around how are our managers going to need to lead going forward, and what does that need to start to look and feel like, and where have we got real skill strengths in that space, and where are we lagging, and therefore what are we doing about it? So it's okay to, you know, you might say we've got low maturity in that space. Well, that's really great, but what are we doing about it then?
Yes.
Because that's the bit we can talk about it, but it's that proactive steps and actions, isn't it? And, you know, even just saying simple things as to a manager, I trust you to make the right decisions for your team, is so powerful, and it gives them autonomy in shaping those things.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Vicki. Paula, I wanted to bring you in as well on some of the points we've heard from panelists, with a particular view on disabled workers. So we've heard the sort of importance around advertising of roles and being really clear up front around the fact that roles offer hybrid and flexible options. And that came up as a particularly important factor from the study, didn't it, in terms of whether someone might even apply or not apply for a role in the first place?
Absolutely. So, you know, Work Foundation analysed Adzuna data, and you know, that as you said at the beginning, you know, remote jobs have been advertised, have declined, hybrids have stalled, and I think analysis of the DWP jobs find a job portal found that only 1% were advertised as remote, and of course that really does limit the ability for people who are wanting to get into work or wanting to change their job to actually find a role that's flexible. So and I think Baroness Scott might be able to confirm this, but I think one of the pieces of evidence submitted to the Select Committee on Home-Based Working was a request or suggestion that employers are mandated to actually advertise in any new role advertising the extent and availability of flexibility, and whether flexibility is not available at all. And I think another way, not just advertising roles, but I think if the government sees remote and hybrid working as a kind of more of a solution to help people back to work, so that would also help drive up the availability of job roles. So, for example, you know, you've got the right to try guarantee, which is going to help people, allow people on health benefits to try work without being reassessed. You've got Connect to Work, which matches people to appropriate jobs if they can't find work or want to change their job. And having much clearer advertising would support those kinds of policy mechanisms as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. And Ros, I'll bring you back in just to see what you did hear from the committee. But we've also had a question from Martin Stevens, which, given we have the benefit of you here, Ros, it would be good just to get your reflections on as well, around the sort of general political landscape on this question. Because obviously it's a few years ago now, but we had the sort of Rees-Mogg approach of sort of leaving notes on people's desks within the civil service, and you know, a sort of sense of sort of chilling around this idea of remote and hybrid working. And I think Martin is referring to some of what has come out of the reform agenda around this as well. Do you feel that, notwithstanding the Employment Rights Act and some of the changes we're going to see, that this is likely to become a bit of a political debate in the years ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent it already is, as you've said. I mean, it's a few years since we had the Rees-Mogg leaving notes, and it was interesting. There was, you know, on our committee a really wide variety of views at the start. I mean, what was interesting was how actually we came together. I mean, I wondered whether we might end up having minority opinions and all of that, but we actually didn't have any of that. You know, I think it's fair to say there was more or less enthusiasm, but you know, a clear understanding at the end of the benefits for very many people. And you know, it's about how you manage the disbenefits on an individual level, but also, you know, managing these organizational issues. But of course, you know, most of my colleagues in the political world aren't sort of taking evidence week after week and looking at it. So that for them, it's very instinctive. So I think it may well be a political thing, and part of it is about this, about the challenge of mixed workforces. So where you get people who can work from home and people who can't, and I think to some extent that's where the political angle comes in. I think it's a stirring up of discontent, actually, in many places where it doesn't exist, because a lot of people recognise they can't do their job, you know, virtually or hybrid or whatever, and that's where again, you know, the management capability and imagination is about thinking about other forms of flexible working that you can offer if you're not able to, you know, if you don't have that sort of role. So I think we are going to hear more of that, and I think it is sort of instinctive stroke political. And similarly with employers, you know, I remember talking to one CEO who just said, the owners have told me they want people in the office, and that is their business, so I've got to make it work. You know, yes. and that was sort of end of discussion. And you know, we can argue all we like, can't we, about how ridiculous that might be or whatever, but in the end they're sort of calling the shots. And I think there's a bit of that sort of feeling in the you know, in the political debate. And I think very specifically to Paula's point then, I mean, we certainly recommended that employers ought to be looking more about clarity when they're advertising. We stopped short of mandating, because that, you know, mandate, especially if you have to have a legal framework, then risks just becoming another minefield and another set of things to be got round. But you know, I think if organisations can understand the benefits to them of being more flexible, then, you know, so I think, you know, what we might do is to see a bit of a move back. And then finally, because I've taken a bit of time here, but it was also clear from some of the organisations we spoke to that the back to office mandate was a deliberate ploy to reduce their workforce.
Interesting. Okay.
I mean, you know, at end of, they just said, well, we needed to downsize, and that just seemed like a way of doing it. Not particularly one I would have taken myself, but you know, that was definitely what we heard.
Wow, that is, in fact, if we had another hour to get into some of that would be good, because that is quite the reveal there. Unfortunately, we've only got a few minutes left. I'm actually going to move us towards a sort of final reflection from each of you, if that's okay. And I suppose where I'd like to just get your final reflections, maybe in sort of no more than 60 seconds, so that I can hear from each of you, is how do we change the conversation on remote and hybrid working in 2026 and try and sort of lose some of the kind of adversarial nature that might have sort of built up over the course of the last couple of years, and really focus on the benefits that it can bring workers and organisations. And Vicki, I'll start with you. If you can, just 60 seconds, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think in terms of really leaning into that, the benefits of it, I think you have to listen to your employees, your colleagues in the organisation, because that's where you're hearing these things feel like in practice ultimately. So for me, I think to hear what the benefits are that are coming through is keep listening. Keep remembering that one size doesn't fit all. So understand your organisation well enough, understand your people well enough to then build what feels right for the future going forward, but keep those kind of listening ears on all of the time to pivot. Like once you do it, you don't have to be fixed to it. These things can change and evolve, and just keep that evolution going with it, but keep the conversation going as well. And they can be big moments in bigger shaping an organisation conversations, or they can be in as little as, how do you feel you're performing at your best at the moment? Does the current circumstances really help you through those regular check-ins as a people manager as well, would be my summary.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vicki. Paula, I'll come to you next.
For me, the ultimate thing, expanding access to remote and hybrid working, firstly by employers allowing desk-based staff the autonomy to decide where they work. Secondly, by increasing the availability of new remote and hybrid jobs. And thirdly, as I said, ensuring that remote and hybrid are made available through the government's Right to Try guarantee, its Connect to Work employment programme, and that interventions trialled for the Keep Britain Working review do include remote and hybrid working to promote workforce health, retention and return to work.
Fabulous. Louise, I'll come to you next.
Thank you. For me, simply, it stop treating hybrid working as a rigid policy and start treating it as a leadership capability. Most organisations aren't struggling with tech or logistics or anything like that they were at the start of the pandemic. They're struggling to lead without that line of sight. That's what this is, a physical line of sight. Invest in that leadership and management capability. Trust without proximity, all of that, and shift it from it being attention in an organisation to it becoming a performance advantage, because ultimately that's what it is.
Fabulous, thank you. And Ros, I'll give the final word to you. Oh, we might have lost. No, yeah, Ros, I'll give the final word to you.
Sorry, I was having trouble. Thank you very much. I think the last point Louise made is really important. I mean, the benefits to individuals are absolutely self-evident and clear. And the bit that's missing is employers and employing organisations understanding what the benefits can be to them. Because if they can see the benefits, then this will continue and grow and thrive. So I think for me, the challenge is about building that leadership and management capacity so that the benefits can be recognised and that ways of working can be developed that enable both the organisations to grow and the employees to thrive in them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think that just about brings us to a close in terms of the conversation this morning. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists for their contributions, to all of you for attending. I've noticed there's been a really vibrant webinar chat going on alongside the event, which is fantastic to see. And of course, the Work Foundation team who lead on producing our analysis and on putting sessions like this together. You can keep up to date with all of the Work Foundation's research and engagement via our website and our social media channels. And in particular, you can find the final report that Paula has been referencing during the discussion of the major Nuffield funded programme, which was focused on the experiences of disabled workers of remote and hybrid work. For now, though, thank you once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable and that you have a productive rest of your day.